Okay, welcome everybody to the May 8th, 2017 meeting of Kubernetes SIG Service Catalog. I am sharing my screen with the agenda. So first thing is that we would like to be able to take the API for Service Catalog to a beta level, which in Kubernetes is important because it means that we are implying that we're basically stating that we're going to be backward compatible with future API changes. So if everybody could please take a look at issue 638, which is linked in the agenda document. There are a couple things that we're sorting through, and it is on my plate to get some time from one of the Kubernetes owners to do an API review for us this week so that we can fix those issues. I think that we know basically the set of issues that we have about the structure, the types. I think there are maybe some things that Doug has added to the agenda today that might be more subtle than necessarily like the structure of the API that we should talk through, but don't necessarily have to solve 100% before we go to beta. Because certain things aren't ready for it yet. So please look at issue 638, and we will have a discussion on that next Monday, which will be May 15th, and intend to try to take things to beta in the 0.1.0 release, which is scheduled for May 17th. So we have a lot of design issues that folks would like to talk through. I am not certain that the remaining 54 minutes of the hour will be enough. So I assume that people will be interested in having design meetings if we need to today, or if we need to this week. And before we dive into them, one thing that I think I've talked about with a couple different people, I know I've talked about it with Vile, is that it would be really good if we could allocate some time to basically go over the Open Service Broker API spec with a fine-tooth comb and create issues for any gaps that we felt we needed to close, or maybe if we feel like something is a gap that's closed but it needs a test around it. I had been thinking that tomorrow might be a really good day to do that. I think, Vile, you have some availability tomorrow. What are other people's availability like that are interested in participating in that? Does tomorrow work?
Depends on time, but yeah. Okay.
I will go ahead and send a meeting invite out after this meeting is over to spend maybe an hour doing that tomorrow.
So, Paul, one quick question for you. So some of us are going to be going off to the Open Source Broker API next week, and I suspect some of us will be flying on Monday itself. So, really, I don't know, for example, when your flight is, but I was wondering what you guys thought about possibly having this phone call earlier next Monday, because personally, I'm not going to be on a plane at this time.
Yeah, I can be flexible, and if I need to, I can wake up like early, and we can do it really early in the morning and make Vile hate his life really bad.
Yeah, we can make life hell for the West Coasters. That's fine with me. I'm okay with that.
What we could also do is we could also kind of circle back later this week. Like if it's more convenient to have it on Friday, I'd be fine having it on Friday. And honestly, that gives us more of a chance to close any gaps. I'm hoping I can close a couple of them that I think we know about. But you know, on the chance that there's anything left to do, probably earlier is better to have that conversation.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think this, yeah, I mean, I think this might not be a bad week to have a few meetings if we think we need them. I forget exactly what we were doing last time when we had this, where every day we would meet for a couple of days in a row. This might be one of those weeks or not.
I would agree. I have no problem with that.
So I don't really anticipate much next week, Monday, if we're going to have a bunch of meetings. That being said, You guys want to just have a standard touch base for the 10 minutes we've been doing for the last couple of weeks? I'm fine with Monday if it's going to be early or whatever.
Yeah, the only thing is on Monday, I will be in London already, and evening is gonna be bad for me there. 7 hours ahead, yes. Anyways.
Okay, well, it sounds like we should perhaps figure out the vagaries of that offline and see if we can start talking through some of these things, unless anybody objects.
Let's do it.
Okay, so first one, I'm gonna open this one up, is Doug has opened an issue asking how do people update pod preset label selectors? And spoiler alert, currently you don't because as a trade-off in order to get the beginnings of the API surface out there, pod presets are currently immutable in the API. So you can change the normal metadata fields like labels and annotations, but you cannot change the pod preset spec once a pod preset has been created. And the rationale basically was that it's very, very complicated to think through updates to objects like this. And conceivably, they might touch every controller that creates a generation of pods in Kubernetes. And it's easier to start with them being immutable and make them mutable in the future than it is to start with them being mutable and wishing that you hadn't. So at this point in time, they're immutable. I would like to see them become mutable, just my own personal wants and desires as a Kubernetes maintainer and as a user. And I think that, for example, if I have a Kubernetes deployment and I have a pod preset that's created that matches that deployment's pod templates labels, that it would be, what I would want is for the deployment to have a new, to roll out a new deployment because of that. Right now in Kubernetes deployments, we don't have any precedent for a mechanism like this. But in OpenShift deployments, which are the thing that was eventually upstream to make Kubernetes deployments, we have the notion of a trigger, where a trigger is something that will cause a new deployment to be created. So as an example, we have a trigger so in OpenShift, we have a set of API resources that model images and in image streams, where an image stream is like a logical image that might have different versions created for it as you rebuild your application. And one of the triggers that we have is an image change trigger. I think that, so before I keep talking, do people get the analogy there? Like if you have a new version of an image built, redeploy the thing.
Actually, Paul, would it be okay if I just describe the issue from a higher level first? For people who haven't actually read it.
Sure, yeah. If you think it's unclear, go for it.
Well, yeah, because the issue is, while the title itself talks about updating pod presets, that's actually not the proposed solution. So if you look at the issue, what I basically talk about here is I have a scenario where I've deployed a deployment. And obviously inside the deployment, there's a label selector that basically describes which pods make up my application. I then have a corresponding binding that has a pod preset inside of there, which has the exact same label selector. So therefore, my deployment and the bindings or the credentials that are going to get created will get bound to the pod preset to those deployment pods, and everything's fine. Later on, I come along and update my deployment by changing the label selector. It's not clear to me how we go about making sure that the pod preset that is associated with my deployment gets updated, right?
So,
whether it gets, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we say never ever change label selectors on deployments because it hoses all sorts of things.
So is it banned or is it just not good practice?
You're likely to hurt yourself if you don't know exactly what you're doing. I'd say it's not banned. Like we don't reject requests where you might do that, but you have to do it carefully. Like for instance, if you change your label selector to be something that isn't a superset of what it was before, for instance, like what happens now, your deployment thinks it has 0 pods, right? What happens there? Like, there's just a lot of weird things that can happen.
Okay, because I was thinking of a scenario where I might twiddle the label selectors to include, version 1 and version 2 of my pods, and I eventually kill off the version 1 side of things. I know there's a rolling upgrade mechanism within deployments, but let's say I want to do it sort of manually. I suspect you're probably saying, well, don't do it that way. Create a second deployment pointing to version 2, right? That's what you'd recommend?
Sorry. So maybe I'll say that there are situations you can't do it. I'd have to think about that one a little more. I'm not sure I understand enough of the use case and details to say yes or no. But I guess I'd say it is complicated. So if that's the use case we're targeting for pod preset, I think it's okay if that is also complicated and requires a lot of explaining, maybe extra steps.
Yeah, because what I'm trying to figure out is if you can do something in vanilla Kubernetes, like modify the label selectors, then it seems like we have to have some path to help people out with the pod preset stuff, because those two sets of label selectors, at least in that case, are supposed to match, right? Because your deployment kind of represents your application, and your pod preset is for your application. So I'm looking for some sort of tight coupling there, because if they're allowed to be modified or differ in any way, then the user's either screwed or have to work really, really hard to make something happen, which they shouldn't have to do. They shouldn't have to work that hard to make it happen. It's my concern.
Do you think that differs significantly from how services work, where those are also somewhat coupled and they need to match?
That's what I was wondering, was whether there's another situation in Kubernetes that had a similar matching like that. And said services, and what's the other thing that they're hooked into? Services versus like deployments?
Services, replica sets, replication controllers.
Well, yeah, but when you say that, I know that all those things can have label selectors, but are they linked? I could see, for example, deployment and a service being linked as a good example.
You're talking
about that one.
Two different resources that you want to converge and operate on the same set of things, that in order to do that, they have to have the same label selector on two different resources, not just one resource's labels have to match the selector on another one, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would almost love it if you had a label selector resource and both deployments and services pointed to that label selector. That way you can update the label selector resource and it just magically gets updated in both because they're both just referencing it. But I know that doesn't exist today.
Yes, that is accurate. That does not exist. Okay, I understood this differently from how it's being explained to me now. I do think there is another set of issues that I'm happy to talk through after this that are the ones that I thought of, but we can continue talking through this if people think it's useful.
So we've got 4 more design items left, and we've got a little over 40 minutes. So if we're assuming each one of those is going to take 10 minutes, might be good to have another dedicated meeting for this specific topic.
Okay. If people want to do that, I will bring up the other issues that are related to this, but not the specific ones that Doug raised once Doug has said his piece. Have you said everything you want to say yet, Doug?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of introduce my high-level concern, so go for it.
Okay. So like I was saying, pod presets are currently immutable. I think that it is best that eventually they become mutable in ways that have behaviors that users want. And on my list of things to do is to create an issue for taking the settings API group to beta, which I will include in that we should work out the mutability story. I also made an issue to work out the mutability story in Kubernetes. There are basically the TLDR is what I've already said, which is that it's easier to start with them being immutable and recreate them if you need to alter them. And we'll figure out all of the right ways to implement mutability in the future. And then there are a couple more facets, which are, this is all spelled out in the issue, I'll just call them out, which is like, if you have one resource that results in another resource being created, how do we prevent users from going and altering the resource that was created? I know that in different UIs for Kubernetes or in the ecosystem, there are guards that say, hey, don't alter this thing because it was made by this other resource. And then there's the story that I started talking through about if we make pod presets mutable, we need to think through the effects and what users would expect for all the different controllers that create generations of pods in Kubernetes. And that's what I've got on that subject. I'm happy to move along.
Just two quick things on that, Paul. We might want to think about the parent references for figuring out what's creating what.
Yep.
And then for the mutability, service or config map and secrets both have actually really similar issues.
Right. Yeah, and there's been some discussion so far about how to make deployments that depend on specific versions of a particular config map or a secret. And this is probably similar. I actually went through and this weekend kind of plumbed some comments in to get linkages into this stuff, the deployment stuff to our issue. So hopefully we can get some at least linkage in GitHub that exists, if not some cross-pollination of ideas.
Do you think as an initial first step, we could offer, could be better or worse to have parity with what they offer?
Well, right now they don't offer anything, so I think we're there.
No, right now they offer, if you change them and then we'll do a rolling update, you get the new data, right?
Okay, so we might want to sidebar on this like offline, but where I left things is my understanding was that there had been a PR open to basically make a snapshot of each version of a config map or a secret as a separate config map and then depend on that one in the deployment. But I don't think it went anywhere.
As a future thing. Okay, cool. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So let's see. Next up is an issue about using the display names versus the Open Service Broker GUID for reference to make linkages to service classes and plans. So Doug pointed out that it is possible to interpret Open Service Broker API spec as such that plan names and service names are mutable. Right now, we're using those names as the names of the Kubernetes objects, and we have a separate property in service class and plan that's like the GUID of those things. The ID is supposed to be stable, and what Doug suggests is that we use the ID instead of the display name as the Kubernetes name, and then use those things as the actual coordinates to refer to those service classes and plans in an instance. I think that we should do that. It sounds like we basically have to if they really are mutable. I made an issue to clarify an Open Service Broker that they are mutable and like call it out explicitly. But I think if they are mutable, we're kind of backed into a corner that we've got to use those things. And it kind of sucks if we have to go that way for people that are just writing YAML files, but we can probably make that a little easier with porcelain commands, which we know we want anyway.
So One thing that I would like to see in the future, probably in the beta cycle, is to have a Kubernetes level abstraction from name to whatever we decide, if it's ID or if it's the broker name. So this, in a way, this is a step backwards because it sucks that you have to reference GUIDs. But it also kind of paves the way, or at least makes it more painfully obvious that we do need some kind of abstraction. And the use case for that abstraction is if you go and port your app to a new cluster, you shouldn't have to change the name or the GUID or whatever we're using from the open service broker side. And instead, you should point to a ref that Kubernetes manages for you. And then as it dereferences that pointer, it figures out what is in the catalog that that name represents.
Yeah, you might want to create an issue about that. In general, we use names as coordinates. So when my best version of what you've said would be like, if we generated like a synthesized name, but I'm not sure that that could be stable because the names, like the display names, have to change.
Well, it absolutely could be stable because it is not a OSB API level abstraction. It's basically it's a resource in the cluster that presents a stable name on the user, on the operator side, and then the other side points to the right thing in the catalog based on what the broker returns.
How did you get it? How did you generate that name though? Because if it doesn't come from the open service broker API,
it would be the operator that generates the name. So it's thinking like something like take object storage, an example we always use, right? The operator generates a resource or somehow generates a name called object storage. But then on the other side, in the spec of this object storage name, it says what in the catalog that actually represents.
So like your resource would be an alias, and if you wanted to, you would be able to use an alias name instead of the actual name of the object, whatever we wind up using to populate the name that comes, the name field of service class, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
So
that worries me a little bit
right now because this is what we have to do based on the OSB spec. So the way that I see this now is that the service class ref in an instance is just going to have a GUID instead of the name.
Yeah, I think that actually the fields would stay the same, but the way that, well, we'd keep the fields for service name and plan name the same. We'd start putting into those things the ID and have a separate field that was the display name, which isn't great, but if that's what we have to do, so be it, right?
Right. Yeah, that really sucks. We might want to consider changing the service class ref in the instance to have different keys. Like one key can say catalog name, or sorry, one key can say service GUID. The other key can be plan GUID instead of what we have now, which I think is service name and plan name.
Yeah, if we feel like collectively there's a strong need for another way of addressing these things, then we could model the coordinates that we use as like a particular object that might be a pointer and part of a union type that we could add other fields to for different variants of the union type later on.
Yeah, so I think we should do that you're talking about, like kind of a pointer, that object, that new object that points to the right thing in the catalog and gives it a canonical name.
I'm talking about in the instance spec that we could introduce a new type that would be like service class and plan coordinates, crappy name just for discussion. Right. And within that, you could have a pointer to an object that had service class name and plan name. And then later on, if we devised a new coordinate system that was better for whatever reason, we could add that as another pointer field in the same object.
Right. Yes, I agree. But I don't think that should be something we do before beta because it's still backward compatible if we do it later.
Yeah, we could do it in a backward compatible way later. And I would like not to be distracted from beta by hypotheticals. But it is something that we should think about.
I'll write up an issue for how my thoughts are, and I'll put it into like O.2 or something, and then we can discuss, fine tune it.
Okay. Are we talked through this one?
That's all I had.
Yeah, the only thing I want to sort of reiterate here is, I guess for Simon or whoever else is going to be working on some of our porcelain, is to look for opportunities to show the human readable name as opposed to the UID wherever you get a chance, or accept that instead of the ID if you get a chance. Because as much as I hate it, as Paul said, I don't think I have much of a choice at this point.
Yeah, I was actually pretty surprised that the name of the thing can change, because for example, there's other fields like they say not to change whether a service is bindable or not, if I remember correctly, but you can change the name all over town. So whatever. I did open an issue to clarify this in Open Service Broker so that we can know that we're making a decision on good information before we start changing.
So I suppose there's another option. I don't think I've ever seen a broker that does change its name on catalog updates. We could just restrict during the beta cycle that it only supports brokers that do not change their names. That would be simpler.
Yeah, we could do that.
Question.
I'm not comfortable with that though.
How are we dealing with conflicts today, right? You got two brokers with the same names coming back.
We don't, and I have queued to make an issue to sort that out.
So this seems very tied to the current discussion, right?
It definitely does, yeah.
So that to me, maybe that's another reason actually to go with GUIDs and then build some canonical naming system on top later.
Yeah, I think we might be talked through this, and maybe we should move on instead of listening to my next stream of consciousness thought on this subject. Any objections?
I'm good with just moving on.
Okay. All right. So next one is this is actually a dupe of an issue that I created, so we might wind up closing this one. But the fundamental problem is that there are three fields we really need to figure out in Open Service Broker API. One of the first two are fields that exist already. They're the org and space IDs. So for those that might not know what those mean, or might be watching on the internet and maybe haven't seen when we've discussed these before, is that Cloud Foundry has a different taxonomy for the units of software that are deployed into Cloud Foundry. So in Kubernetes, we have namespaces, and that is our way of dividing up a cluster. In Cloud Foundry, there are two levels of taxonomy. One is org, which, as I understand it, is like a grouping of related, like departmental type interests. And then within organizations are different spaces, which sound like they are more analogous to namespaces in Kubernetes. Is that roughly how the people on this meeting right now that have the context understand those things? Did I explain them correctly?
Yeah, to help, a lot of people view Cloud Foundry spaces as much like your staging pipeline. You know, you have a dev space, a testing space, and then a production space. That's a lot of times the way they view it.
So maybe I didn't.
Conceptually, it's whatever you want it to be.
It sounds in that example like an org is kind of analogous to a namespace. And then within a namespace, you'd have like different areas for different concerns. Is that how they're typically used?
You could choose to do it that way. I mean, go ahead, Relay.
No, I was going to say my understanding org ID is more akin to something like billing department or something. So these, I mean, it kind of ties into the who is allowed to do what. But
right. Yeah, I would agree. Org is definitely more for organization kind of thing. But the way you set up your spaces is pretty much up to you, right? You can look at it as part of a pipeline. You can look at it as completely random things. It's completely up to you.
Yeah, the only reason I brought up the org ID thing is because the cluster ID seems a little bit different in a sense that if, for example, you're running multi-clusters and an organization wants to go ahead and it kind of bleeds over into the like RBAC, I guess. So that's why I'm not sure that first mapping is correct.
Yeah, so in addition to these org and space fields, there's also a new field which is proposed but not accepted to the API yet, which is the context, which we had hoped to be a place to send Kubernetes relevant coordinates, like what cluster am I coming from, what namespace am I in, and we need to figure out what do we send there. So that's the fundamental issue. There's, as usual in Kubernetes land, tons of entanglements and different facets. Doug, did I state that correctly?
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on what Vile was saying there. I agree that org, it may not necessarily be a best match for cluster ID, but given the fact that org and space are required fields that we have to send today, I was trying to think of what would be the most useful information we could stick in there, even if it wasn't a perfect match. Saving the context field that Paul mentioned as the real place we stick in, you know, the real data with the real names, that it's a better description. Because I wanted us to be able to try to at least to talk to existing brokers today and provide them with meaningful information if they did try to talk back to the platform. And I figured cluster ID and namespace GUID are probably the two most important things that we have to offer at this point in time. That's why I lumped them into org and space.
So.
No, I totally get it. I wonder if it would be interesting. It might be useful to go ahead and spend a little time understanding what decisions a broker might make based on the org ID. I totally get it how the space ID, it makes sense for you to go ahead and make things like, oh, I'm going to split up closer to somewhere. I don't understand what the org ID is used, and my apologies if it's already this bug. I haven't read through it.
Yeah, org ID for the most part is going to be, like you mentioned, you know, it's organizational, so it's probably going to be used for tracking down billing purposes and stuff like that.
Okay.
So I thought of a couple monkey wrenches to throw out about this over the weekend. Is that I wonder if there is any use case where a Kubernetes user needs to send like a particular value that we don't have in Kubernetes. Like say that they need to send a Cloud Foundry org ID that we just don't know about. I wonder if we might want to have fields on instance that govern how these are sent for instances and for the bindings to that instance. But I will put that in a comment. I just wanted to raise that.
And for that kind of,
go ahead.
For that kind of thing, I think that's where parameters will come into play, because that's the only place that the user has the ability to add extra data.
I
mean, in our API.
Right, because I think today what happens is that the org doesn't. I have to go back, but isn't the org derived by the Cloud Foundry controller by the user making the request, so it knows because there is an org created for it. Mm-hmm. So I think what Paul is saying is that because we don't have such a way to come in and say, for example, hey, yo, controller, give me an org, we could say on whether it's on instance basis or whether it's per request basis to go and say, hey, go ahead and use this organization. That would be another way to do this rather than manufacture it from some piece of information that might not really make sense, if I paraphrase that properly.
Well, and so to add on to that, it doesn't, org is such a thing that it doesn't seem like a developer or someone submitting an instance, whatever you want to call that person, we wouldn't want to make them the person responsible for setting the org. It seems like it would be the person that installs Service Catalog as the operator.
Probably shouldn't let them specify the org, otherwise big back hole into getting billing to whichever group you want, right?
Yeah.
Right. And that might mean maybe we annotate the namespace with that information and check the namespace to see if there's a specific value that namespace wants to send as the org. There's a ton of different ways that we can do it.
That's one of the reasons why I jumped on the idea of a cluster ID, because it's out of the scope of the user to mess with. It's something that's unique. But we can talk about the specific values later, but I just wanted to make sure everybody understood this particular issue. And that's what's coming up. Go ahead.
No, I think we definitely need to figure that out. And I think that this is just as part of the what the API looks like is the semantics and what things matter. And it is a bit tricky as it bleeds over.
And just to let you guys know, the reason that this came up is because in the Bluemix environment, we have multiple Kubernetes clusters out there. And so if the only information that a compliant service broker is going to see today is org and space, we needed a really good way for him to get, and I did some kind of identifier to let us know which Kubernetes cluster he's talking to or is being acted upon here.
Now this reminds me
that's where the original issue came from.
Is you and I had a discussion about this before, and I seem to recall that you brought up that a broker could use the auth principle that the catalog or the platform was authenticated as, basically as a way to figure that out. I was thinking about that as a potential stopgap for having to identify cluster identity, because cluster identity is a really complex topic, I think. If you get into cluster federation and you might have different facets of different clusters that are federated differently, but ultimately refer back to the same thing. Without getting into that, I'll bring that up as something that I seem to recall that you suggested as something brokers could do to guess at that information for now. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, it does. And I think at that point in time, I had this mental model where Bluemix was going to have basically one gigantic instance of Kubernetes, and it was going to be a multi-tenant instance. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, since then, the world has changed and Bluemix has changed. And now we actually have multiple instances of Kubernetes under one platform. So therefore, you could think of it as one gigantic platform talking to the service broker, and that platform, when he talks to the service broker, is not going to be able to. The broker is not going to be able to know which instance of Kubernetes he's referring to just from the platform itself, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I think that if I read between the lines in this discussion, I can easily imagine situations that might have some similarity to this in Cloud Foundry, where you might have multiple Cloud Foundry instances that have organizations and spaces that span multiple Cloud Foundries, and I wonder what brokers do today. I almost think this is another case where we might want to ask for clarification about what do existing brokers do in that situation? Is it a real situation, etc. I don't think that we're going to have a thing that we can point to immediately as being a good cluster ID. So I liked your idea of using different credentials for different clusters so that the broker can use its own auth principle as that last coordinate.
Yeah, but just two things on that. One is, at least for the Bluemix scenario, we're not going to be able to have different auth credentials because we actually do have, in essence, a global service catalog who's doing the registration with the brokers. It's not per cluster. So clusters will get spun up and torn down all the time. Now, the other point of, I agree with you. Right now, we don't have a good cluster ID. I'm doing some investigation, though, because I'm being told that under federation, we may have something close to a cluster ID that we may be able to reuse, but I'm not 100% sure what it's being used for today. So I'm still doing some investigation there to see if we can reuse it or not. And I'll let you guys know what happens.
Would you mind sending me over any links you find about that? Because I've also been wondering about it, but just with being out last week, I haven't had a chance to do much digging.
Yeah, I've been trying to add comments into this particular issue at the bottom as I find out information. Whether we use it or not is a different story. But if I find it,
okay, I see you've been adding it. Okay, cool.
Yep.
All right.
Have we considered just putting our own like service catalog ID, because we can install whatever we want, right?
Yes, that was mentioned in the issue. Whether we call it cluster ID or service catalog ID, we definitely could do something like that. I'd like to save that for after we exhaust the idea of using something that's already there or something that can be used at a more global level. Because I think this will be needed for other purposes, just besides just service catalog. So I'd rather hold that off for right now.
That seems like a good escape hatch if we can't figure anything else out, though.
Yes.
So maybe we'll keep that card up our sleeve.
So I haven't committed, or I haven't submitted this comment yet, but that was one thing I suggested, is like literally a command line flag for cluster ID or org or whatever you want to call it. There are a few different names, I think, here for the top level org parameter. I don't want to solve this for anything else but service catalog, so I'd just warn against that. This is a unique situation just for brokers, I believe.
Yeah,
it depends on which issue you're talking about. So if you're talking about what to stick in org, agreed, that's our problem. If you're talking about the ability to identify which Kubernetes cluster you're talking about on a particular message flow, I actually think that's broader than the service catalog. In fact, Simon pointed me to an issue where Brandon Phillips from CoreOS mentioned he has use cases where he'd like to have a cluster ID type of thing as well. So if we could solve it for both, that's great. But yeah, if we can't, then it's also that escape hatch will do it just for ourselves.
Sweet. Yeah, I'm on the same page.
One danger is if their use case looks the same as ours, but turns out to be different, and then we both depend on the same thing, and reduces flexibility.
Yeah, that's why I want to do the investigation first before we decide. Yep.
Okay.
So Doug, I see that this, actually I missed, which milestone is this ticket in?
I may have tagged it as 0.1 just because I want to have the design discussion before we nail down the...
Okay, do you mind if I change it to there? It's in 0.0.6 right now, but I don't think...
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's all. Thanks.
So the last one on the list is similar to this one. As long as we're talking about mismatches between taxonomies, why don't we talk about this app ID one, and then we can talk broker updates. So Doug, why don't you articulate this one?
Okay, let me refresh my memory here. Okay, yeah, so in this particular case, I'm worried about the situation where a service broker may be looking at the fields that it's given to do some sort of determination. So, for example, it may look at the org, space, and app ID to decide whether or not, for example, to reuse a previously sent set of credentials, right? It may decide that if I see the same value for all three as what I saw before, it must be the same app, therefore I'm just going to return the exact same credentials. Any one of those three change, and suddenly, maybe I'll create new credentials this time, right? Something along those lines. Basically, the specification is pretty wide open in terms of what brokers can and can't do, how it makes these determinations, and so we never quite know what's going on in their mind. So with that in mind, I thought we should probably stop sending the namespace ID for the app ID, because even though technically that's kind of what we're doing right now, right? We're binding the secrets to the namespace, or it's available inside a namespace, I should say. That's not quite accurate enough or fine-grained enough when you start talking about multiple applications being deployed to the same namespace, right? The broker may want to distinguish between those two, even though they're in the same namespace. So I think it'd be nice if we can come up with some algorithm or something that can generate an app ID on a per application basis. And we need to then obviously discuss what defines an application, right? And as a straw man proposal, I said, well, let's just take the label selectors and do some sort of hash on that. But I'm open to any idea to try to produce something that's more fine-grained than just namespace. So that's the idea behind this one.
We could use the binding UID.
The problem is that doesn't provide us any relationship at all to the application, whatever an application means, right?
Yep.
Because if you try to do the same binding to the same application, it'd be nice if we could communicate that to the broker.
So I saw that you opened another issue for multiple bindings to the same app. Like, do we have a specific example of what that looks like and why you'd want to do it?
I have 0 use cases for why you'd want to do it. I've heard people express opinions both directions on that one, to be perfectly honest.
The only reason I see it being useful was if you had bindings that had parameters.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want this connection to the database to be read-only.
Correct. That's the one that we have had.
Okay.
And that kind of implies that there are multiple teams, for lack of a better term, that are using the same concept of an app.
Well,
like say it's in dev.
The read-write versus read-only, you might have one team that's like, I want to send, I have a separate read-only connection to the database for things like views and stuff I know isn't going to invoke a stored procedure. And then I've got my write connection, and maybe I want to do some switching in my application between a read-only connection and a read-write connection. And
so I don't know if we want to open the discussion for the other ticket about multiple bindings to an app. It's highly related here, but I think it might be a rabbit hole. I am happy.
We're running out of time either way.
Okay.
Well, I just want to mention one thing here. One of the issues with multiple bindings to the same app is that there's no requirement whatsoever in the credentials that come back to identify which one is which, right? And so as an application, if I have 2 different secrets bound to my application, it's not clear to me how I know which secret applies to the read-only versus the read-write. And there's no guarantee to without some other out-of-band communication, there's no way to know what's going on. And it's even worse in something like Cloud Foundry, where everything's bunched together into one DCAP service as a environment variable, right? All you get is just a chunk of JSON. You have no idea which connections to MySQL is for what. So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward with this.
Okay, so we have 8 minutes left. I think we should talk through the last one that was on the agenda, which is broker update semantics. Unless anybody has things they want to say about this last thing that we've been talking through.
Yeah, so this one came up because of, I'm sorry, go ahead. Someone can I say something?
No, I was just going to go and say, I think it was Jessica who said that implies maybe it wasn't about bindings requiring parameters. So the bindings can take parameters on the creation time.
Yep.
Yeah, you can. But there's no way for an application looking at the credentials to necessarily know what those parameters are unless the broker just happens to include them in the credentials.
No. Correct. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Because at least I misunderstood as bindings cannot take parameters, but they can.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so this last issue, so this issue came around because as I was working through with the Bluemix guys about, hooking this into our system and stuff, the idea of periodically a platform is supposed to check with the service broker to see if anything's changed in its catalog. New services get added or deleted or whatever. And so then, of course, you have the problem of a service gets deleted or a plan gets deleted. That's easy enough if no one's actually using either one of those. But if someone is using that service or that plan, what do? Right? You don't want to necessarily completely kill off their application or kill their application by deleting the stuff. What I've seen happen in Cloud Foundry is what they'll do is they'll mark the plan as being inactive, and that will also then signal that no one can then use the service that service broker. I'm sorry, the service itself if all of its plans are inactive. And what that allows you to do is to basically prevent those services and plans from being visible to an end user when they ask what's available, but allows the current application to continue on its merry way. And then as they end up killing off those bindings and stop using those plans, something in the system will detect, oh, okay, I can now garbage collect this thing, and then things can slowly start disappearing. So that's what this issue is all about. We need to think about how we want to manage that in Kubernetes.
This is another area that the spec is extremely loose in what it says. I think it says that you shouldn't delete a plan because it might mess something up. And that's basically as far as it goes.
So in the last face-to-face, we talked about this issue in the context of a user trying to kubectl delete a broker and an instance. And what we decided is pretty similar, Doug, to what you said should happen.
Okay, and that's fine. That like as I said, Cloud Foundry I think does that, so it's obviously a viable path. We just need to work through the design implications before we lock down the schema in case something changes there.
So Aaron, would you go and plumb into this issue your understanding of our last conversation that we had on that subject for the user initiated stuff? I had actually forgotten that we had discussed that. Yeah,
I'll start writing it up in this comment and post it when I'm done.
Okay, cool. So we have 5 minutes left. Anything that folks would like to bring up that hasn't been brought up yet?
Well, did you pick a time for the meetings, for the follow-on meetings?
I'm happy to do. I'm happy to do that now. I had no time in mind yet. I prefer to do those things in the afternoon so I can try to get like productive stuff done in the morning. I could do at 2 o'clock Eastern or later.
If you're talking just tomorrow, that's fine with me.
Does anybody who wants to participate in that have a conflict?
I have only a half, let's see. It'll be 11 Pacific. So I can't really do anything until about 2-ish Pacific, the problem. Or I can do, that's pretty much it for tomorrow.
I could do 2 Pacific, 5 o'clock Eastern to 5. Actually, I can't go probably too much past 5. In fact, I have something starting at 5.
Okay, I can make. I can also make. Yeah, you can, I can also make 9 Pacific, and that's noon Eastern.
I have half an hour at that time before Open Service Broker Working Group starts, which lucky for you, Aaron, you didn't already have that.
Yeah, you should join our call, Aaron. You know you're going to anyway. So
I've been telling this guy he needs to join for weeks. Do it.
So, okay. So you guys are thinking 2 Eastern, I can join that for about a half hour or so.
Okay.
That'll be good enough I'm assuming we're not just going to have one meeting, or if we do, it's going to be the whole day, and then I can drop off and rejoin later.
Yeah, I think I'll send something for 2 to 3 Eastern, and we'll get through what we get through.
Just for everybody else, really quickly. So I've been chatting with Paul a little bit and Aaron about where to do the resource check-ins for the asynchronous conditions so that we don't allow mods. So I'm waiting to hear back from what is it, SIG API, whatever it is.
API machinery.
That one, to see if they have any suggestions because it's not clear, much like the conditions.
Sure.
Do you have an issue or a PR that I can link people to yet for that, Vile? Did you put that in Slack and I didn't see it?
I didn't create a PR. I just phrased the question. I could put that into an issue if that would make it easier. I can do that. If the way I phrased it in the channel is clear enough, I tried to boil it down to a very specific.
I think the way that you phrased it in the channel is very clear. If you make an issue about it, I'll point Derek to that. But spoiler alert, that's basically what admission controllers, that's one of their jobs. Yes. Okay, so I have one last thing, which is that I was at Red Hat Summit last week, which for people that don't know, it's like Red Hat's GCP Next, or I know Deus had a summit. It's basically a session to talk to Red Hat, like users and customers and stuff like that, and for them to talk to other customers and so forth. And we had a keynote that we showed a demo of the OpenShift integration with the Service Catalog, and I had a talk where we talked about the mechanics, low-level mechanics of the API, and Ansible Service Broker that we're working on. And there's a tremendous amount of interest amongst users of OpenShift for this stuff and in the Kubernetes community in general. So thanks to everybody that has contributed to help make that a success so far. And that's what I've got. Anything else?
Just Vile, thanks a lot for doing all that investigation. I know this async stuff has been going on for a while, so I appreciate it a ton.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Vile has got to jump hurdles in the dark. All the different kinds that we have in this thing. Oh, okay, that reminds me of one more thing, which is that going back to a previous hurdle that we've jumped in the dark, I opened a pull request to the community repo, changing the API conventions document to try to clarify when we should use a condition and when we should just have a field on status. I reached out to a couple of the Kubernetes owners to see if I could get some eyes on that, because that's something that we've spent a fair amount of time figuring out, and we should try to make it better for the next guy. Yay.
Hey, Paul, one thing I forgot. I think when we talked about trying to lock down the resource model, you talked about having some Kubernetes guru or something come in and look at our resource model, and you're going to, I think, schedule a time for them to do a review with us. Am I remembering it correctly?
That's the API review. That's the API review I was talking about. Didn't have a chance to do it last week with Summit and some other stuff that came up that I had to deal with, but I'm going to see if I can get someone to look at it. I sincerely doubt you will get interactive time with them. They may leave comments, but I'll see what I can do.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. All right, well, we're 1 minute over time, so I'll stop it there. Thanks, everybody, for coming. See you soon, and everybody have a great day or night. All right, later on.